Welcome to our online lecture for our class Europe since 1848. Today we are going to discuss classical liberalism. And as always, there are some key terms and ideas that you should be able to recognize by the time this lesson is over. There also are some good discussion questions that you should be able to answer, or at least contribute to, by the time you get to the last slide. So look these over and let's get to it. As we discussed previously in class, the dominant political ideology after the Congress of Vienna in 1815 was conservatism. Conservative forces were in control of most of the great powers of Europe. These forces worked to stifle human rights and free expression. They also endorsed the idea of monarchy and governments dominated only by elites. This is because the French Revolution taught them that the people could not be trusted to rule themselves. Still, the ideas of the Enlightenment were not dead. Those ideas are obvious in the philosophy known as liberalism. Liberalism is born in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment lasted roughly from 1650 until 1800, and it involved an emphasis on human dignity, human rights, and human equality. It was also a belief that people should be able to have some say in their government. One of the best examples of the ideas of the Enlightenment is our own Declaration of Independence. In the second paragraph of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson writes, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." End quote. You can see the Enlightenment right here in lines like "all men are created equal" and "unalienable rights." Moreover, Jefferson argues that the government's purpose is to preserve those rights, and that government gets its power from the people. Another good example of the ideas of the Enlightenment in action occurs in the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the French Revolution. Here are just a few of the many points taken from that declaration. Again, there is the idea that people are free and equal. Section 2 says that government's intent is to preserve human liberty. Finally, point 3 agrees with Jefferson that sovereignty, in other words, the right to rule, comes not from a king or a queen or even from God. In other words, it comes from the people. As I have said earlier, liberalism and the ideas of the Enlightenment were discredited by the French Revolution. The chaos of the Great Terror, followed by Napoleon and his march across Europe, proved that people could not be trusted to govern themselves. Only a conservative king or queen could do so. But the ideas of liberalism do not go away. Instead, those ideas continue to percolate among Europe's intellectuals. Most popular is the basic definition of liberalism as a philosophy that preaches the freedom from economic and government restraint. This means giving people the right to vote for their leaders and ending government censorship of speech and press. People also should be able to worship as they please. Finally, governments should be restrained or limited by constitutions that clearly will outline what a government can and cannot do. Now, of course, there were limits to this human freedom. As John Stuart Mill argued, human freedom did not include the freedom to hurt others, nor did it involve freedom for all of the people. In fact, most liberals argued that only property owners should have the right to vote. This is because only property owners had an investment in society. Moreover, voting should be limited to men. As far as economics went, one of the key liberal philosophers was Adam Smith. Smith argued that there should be no government interference with the economy. That meant that government should no longer put tariffs on foreign imports. Instead, it should support free markets between all nations and free trade between all nations. Smith's idea is best expressed in his notion of the invisible hand of supply and demand. Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations, his classic book, that as long as it was left unrestrained, the market, or the ideas of supply and demand, was the best way to create wealth for everyone. Of course, not all liberals agreed on everything, nor did liberalism account for all of the problems in society. This began to trouble even the staunchest liberal thinkers, including John Stuart Mill. Mill was especially troubled by Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand of supply and demand. This laissez-faire approach to economics did not seem to address the very real problems of economic injustice raised by the Industrial Revolution. Mill ultimately will criticize liberals who preached a laissez-faire theory by claiming they were ignoring the problems of unsafe working conditions, low pay, and long working hours. These ideas, he claimed, were an infringement on the liberal emphasis on human dignity. Another area where Mill will break with some of his liberal partners is over women's rights. Ultimately, will come around to the notion that all men and women are created equal. He bases this notion in good liberal thought. Here's one of his quotes. The principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement, and that it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality, admitting no power or privilege on the one side, nor disability on the other. End quote. So where are we? Well, by 1848, liberalism was coming to challenge conservatism as a ruling philosophy. And liberalism in 1848 meant largely those things we have already enumerated. It was a demand for popular government. In other words, people should have the right to choose their leaders. There also was an emphasis upon protections for human rights and human dignity. And finally, one of the things liberals were calling for most was a constitutional government. In other words, governments that were restrained by written constitutions that explained exactly what powers government had and what powers government didn't have.